Mark used to believe that love was something you finished building early in life, like a house you move into and stop noticing once the furniture is in place. At 35, he thought he was doing everything right. He worked long hours at a marketing firm in Chicago, paid the bills on time, and came home to a quiet, orderly apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. To him, that meant stability. That meant success. Emily saw it differently. Every morning, she woke up before Mark, even when she barely slept. She moved through the kitchen softly, careful not to wake him, packing his lunch the way she always had. Sandwich cut diagonally, a small note folded inside, even though he never mentioned it. She watched him scroll through his phone at breakfast, his thumb moving faster than his eyes, and waited for him to ask how she was doing. Most days, he didn't. Mark wasn't cruel. That was the problem. He was polite, distant, and distracted. When Emily talked about her day, he answered with short nods, his mind still at work. When she asked if they could go out for dinner like they used to, he promised, soon. A word that quietly replaced tonight, then this weekend, then maybe next month. Over time, Emily stopped reminding him. She stopped asking questions that went unanswered. She stopped setting the table for two. Mark noticed the changes but explained them away. People change, he told himself. Marriage settles. This was normal. He didn't see that what was fading wasn't excitement, it was presence. One night, Mark came home late, loosened his tie, and dropped his keys on the counter without calling out her name. The apartment felt different. Heavier somehow. On the kitchen table, beneath the dim light, lay a folded piece of paper. "I'm still here," it said. "I just don't know if you see me anymore." Mark read it once, then again. He exhaled, folded the note, and slipped it into his pocket, telling himself they would talk on the weekend. That there was time. He went to bed alone that night, scrolling through emails, unaware that the quiet beside him wasn't peace. It was a warning. Emily left on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary weekday that never feels important until years later. Mark noticed it first when he reached for his phone charger and found her side of the bed untouched. The pillow was cold, the sheets neatly smoothed, as if she had taken extra care not to leave a mess behind. On the nightstand sat her wedding ring, placed carefully on top of a folded receipt from the grocery store. Milk, bread, coffee. The everyday things she always remembered. At first, Mark felt confused more than afraid. There was no note this time, no dramatic goodbye. He checked his phone, half expecting a message explaining everything. There was nothing. He told himself she'd gone to clear her head, that she needed space. Space was reasonable. Space was temporary. The hours dragged on. Mark moved through the apartment, noticing details he had ignored for years. The empty hook where her purse used to hang, the missing toothbrush, the silence that followed him from room to room. By evening, the realization settled in. This wasn't a pause. It was a decision. Days passed. Mark ate takeout straight from the container, sitting on the couch where Emily used to curl her feet beneath her. He watched TV without really watching, the remote heavy in his hand. At work, he stared at his screen, rereading the same sentence over and over. When coworkers asked if he was okay, he smiled and said he was just tired. At night, the apartment felt too big. He reached for his phone again and again, typing messages he erased before sending. "I miss you." Delete. "Can we talk?" Delete. He didn't know how to begin because he had never learned how to listen. One evening, while searching for a clean mug, Mark found Emily's favorite coffee cup pushed to the back of the cabinet. It was chipped along the rim, imperfect, and suddenly unbearable to hold. He remembered teasing her about it, how she laughed and said some things were worth keeping even when they weren't perfect. He sat on the kitchen floor, the mug in his hands, and understood something he had avoided for years. Emily hadn't left suddenly. She had been leaving slowly every time he chose everything else first. And now the space beside him was no longer empty. It was loud with regret. Mark found Emily a month later at her sister's townhouse on the quiet edge of the city. The place smelled like fresh paint and laundry soap, a space that felt temporary but intentional, like someone rebuilding themselves carefully. When Emily opened the door, Mark almost didn't recognize her. She looked rested, lighter. There was a calm in her eyes that hadn't been there in years. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around warm mugs. For a moment, neither spoke. Mark realized how often he had filled silence before, talking just to avoid discomfort. This time, he waited. "I didn't leave to punish you," Emily said finally, her voice steady. "I left because I was disappearing in my own life." Mark nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to explain himself, to list his intentions, his stress, his exhaustion. Instead, he said the one thing he had never said clearly before. "I stopped paying attention," he admitted. "Not because you mattered less, but because I forgot that love needs showing, not assuming." Emily looked down at her hands. "I needed you to choose me," she said. "Not once, not in words, but in the small moments, the ones that make a marriage feel alive." Mark didn't promise that he would never fail. He didn't talk about forever or grand gestures. He spoke about change in practical terms. Coming home on time, putting his phone away, listening without defending himself, about therapy, about learning how to be present even when it was uncomfortable. Days later, Emily agreed to try again, slowly. Separate spaces at first, weekly dinners, honest conversations that didn't end when they got difficult. It wasn't romantic in the way movies show. It was quiet work, sometimes awkward, sometimes painful. But it was real. One evening, weeks later, Emily came back to the apartment to grab a few more things. Mark cooked dinner, not perfectly, but sincerely. They ate at the table, no screens, no distractions. When Emily laughed at something small and ordinary, Mark felt something shift inside him. Later, as she stood by the door, Emily hesitated. She reached for his hand, not as a promise, but as a possibility. Mark understood then that love wasn't about getting his wife back. It was about becoming someone she could stay with,